Hey guys, I'm Nick Pregnance with DuramaxTuner.com. Today on this Diesel Insights, we're going to talk about gear ratios, tire sizes, and how they impact drivability and performance of the truck. Up on the board behind me, I've drawn my own grade school rendition of a dyno curve, and this is just for your benefit. The pink line is horsepower, the highlighter or yellow line is torque, and you can see that as RPM increases, torque peaks at roughly 15 or 1600 RPM, horsepower peaks at maybe 2900 RPM, and they both fall off shortly past 3000 RPM. This is very typical of today's modern diesel engines, whether it be a Dodge, a Ford, or a GM. They're all pretty close in this regard. The reason I drew these curves is because I want to illustrate the power curve of the engine, and I want to illustrate what changing gear size or what changing tire size does to the usable RPM range of the engine and kind of how that impacts the drivability of the engine. So, on your typical GM, typical Dodge, typical Ford, let's just say your two-wheel drive, 3/4 ton truck, call it a 373 gear. Normal operating range of the engine is from peak torque, somewhere around 15 or 1600 RPM, out to 2900 RPM, which would be your full throttle shift point. But during normal driving, you're not going to be usually over 15 or 1600 RPM. You're going to be cruising in that 1100 to 15 or 1600 RPM range, and that's going to give you the maximum efficiency out of the truck. As you start to lean into the throttle more, you're going to call for more RPM, of course more boost, and the engine's going to use a little bit more RPM. It might go up to 2200 RPM or higher if you're working the truck. Let's say you have a trailer behind it, it might even shift out at 2500 RPM, or if you're really flooring it, it might shift out at 3000 RPM. The reason it does that is because the higher the RPM, the more airflow the engine gets, the more power it can make, and the more efficiently it can do so in most cases. Now there's limits to all that, and we'll get into that in a second. So speaking of efficiency, where's the max efficiency of the engine? Well, typically it's right around that peak torque number. That peak torque number represents the maximum efficiency of the engine. And you'll notice that when the engine's working, really working, you're going to be working between peak torque and maximum rated speed, but usually a little bit short of that, usually between 1600 and 2400 RPM. However, if you're on either side of those 1600 and 2400, you're going to start to run into inefficiencies. So at higher RPM, that inefficiency is going to manifest itself as excessive heat and temperature in the exhaust system. So you're trying to spin the engine faster, and you can't get all the exhaust system starts to get choked up, is working harder. The turbocharger is working at the end of its map. So you're starting to push things a little further out there. And you have all the parasitic loss of valve train, parts moving fast, right? Oil slinging. You're wasting a lot of fuel generating that power. Same thing below peak torque. So we have inefficiencies. They're not the same inefficiencies. They usually manifest themselves as the engine doesn't run the turbocharger as well. So we have trouble getting the turbocharger up to speed. We have to run what we call stoichiometrically rich, we run a stoichiometrically rich condition to get there. So the engine has a tendency to run rich, create a lot of particulate matter, DPF issues. So we have those issues at low engine speed. Also, low engine speeds, in order to make a lot of power, you have to run really high torque output, and that's harder on the internals. So you're either making that power by turning high engine speed and medium torque, or high torque and low engine speed. The lower engine speed we run, engines aren't happy. We've all experienced that lugging, that smoke output, lack of response, that sort of thing. Why does this matter? I want you to think about Ford's F450 for a minute. The F450 2017, 19, 20, 430 gear from the factory. Why do they give you a 430 gear? Well, the 430 gear is there because it's got a huge towing capacity. So how do those two things go together? I mean, the F250 makes the same power. The frame's the same. Like, why can't you tow the same in the F250? The reason the F450 can tow more, aside from its tire size and hitch capacity, is it's running in the efficient range, RPM-wise, pretty much all the time. And it's able to do that because it has a 430 gear. Now, what the 430 gear does is, under full load operating conditions, it keeps the truck in a very narrow operating range. So when it shifts, it's not going down near 2,000 RPM. It's going down around 2,400 RPM, sometimes less than that. Out to 3,000, only a 300 or 400 RPM drop maybe. Interesting. Okay, so they're really trying to keep that efficiency window, keep that truck operating in a narrow efficiency window. Remember, the narrower the window the truck operates, the more efficiently it can operate. It's part of why we're seeing all the OEMs going to 10-speed transmissions, because they can really narrow in on where they want to operate that truck. Okay, well, we've seen the line on the F450. What does the 250 look like? Well, 250 is available with a few different gear selections, but let's think about that. Let's call it a 370 gear. So that's quite a bit wider operating range. So now when we come off that full throttle shift, instead of having the power we have available here, we have the power available here. And if you notice on that graph, that power is less. The torque is more, but the power is less. So is that truck going to pull better or worse after that gear change? It's going to pull worse because it doesn't have as much power. Okay, so what if I take my F250 that has stock tires on it and I put 35-inch tires on it? What does that do to the operating range when it shifts? We'll call that 35s and 373s. When it shifts, it's going to drop even further. That's called shift extension. And instead of 2,000 or 2,100 RPM, all of a sudden with those 35-inch tires, you're down at 2,000 RPM. So you're even lower in the rev range. Now what that's going to do is give you even less power to pull through, yes, but it's going to make the truck closer to that, to that inefficient range when you're not on full throttle. So if you shift at part throttle and the truck comes down to 1,100 RPM or 1050 or 1,200 RPM, those areas are where you can get into stoichiometrically rich conditions. So you can start getting in a situation where the truck is a little richer than it used to be from the factory. It's not a big deal. The transmission shift points can be adjusted and we can work around it. But anytime you have that shift extension widening, you have to have the engine be efficient in a wider range or run less peak load, because the thing's just not going to be as happy on the ends of that load range. Now this is 35s and 373s. You can imagine if I have 355 gears or 331 gears and I have 37-inch tires, this extension keeps widening and widening and widening. Now the reason I bring that up is because guys often put different tires on their trucks and they don't change the gears, which is fine if you're not towing at gross vehicle weight. However, if you're towing at gross vehicle weight and you want to maintain that factory shift extension because you want to take advantage of those efficiencies in the engine, it's a good idea to consider a gear set. If you consider a gear set, you'll come from this wider shift extension down to the narrow shift extension, and the truck's going to be a lot happier. There's a few other factors that come into play here that I want to go over. Usually, guys aren't operating at gross vehicle weight. Most of the guys watching this probably have their trucks tuned, so your operating range of the engine feels wider anyway. The truck is making more torque, and that's okay. If the truck feels like it has a wider operating curve, like our tuning offers you, then yeah, the truck will probably be happy with 35-inch tires. Just keep in mind, if you go to 37s or you go bigger, right, that this is the experience you're going to have, is that the truck is going to come off that shift a little soggier. Also, if you change the turbocharger on your truck, the operating range of the engine is going to change. So instead of making power like this, your truck with a bigger turbocharger might make power like this. Might make more power, pardon my drawing, but it's going to be a narrower peak. So when we do transmission tuning, the whole point of this is to manage the shift extension, manage where the engine's operating so that we take advantage of where the efficient range of the engine is and keep it there, especially when you're running loaded, so we don't get extra smoky trucks, you get good response, we get downshifts when they're supposed to happen. The moral of the story is, if you change your tire size and you go up, not only have you added more load to your truck, but you have widened the operating range of the engine, and usually you've done so in a way that's not favorable to performance or drivability. The best thing you can do in that situation is to put a gear set in to narrow that scope back down and keep that thing operating in its efficient window and keep it happy, especially if you're towing. It's going to make a big difference. I'm Nick Pregnitz with DuramaxTuner.com. Hope you enjoyed this segment of Diesel Insights. We'll catch you next time.